Can everybody hear? Good. Thank you very much, Pauline, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be speaking to a live audience, which I have not done since the 31st of January, which was, and then the COVID came and no one wanted to have me anywhere. So, I'm very grateful to Pauline for giving me this outing. Thank you. Now, the story I'm going to tell you today is really Australian history, which we were never taught at school. Actually, it's the beginning of the European settlement of Australia, and it is an exciting story, one of the great stories of world adventure. But we were always taught Australian history, I thought, in a bit of a vacuum, as if not the context in which it took place. So I want to try and rectify that to some extent. And we start, and you might think, well, it's not very relevant, but it is very relevant, and that is we start with this chap, who is Claudius Ptolemy, the Greek thinker. And in about 150 AD, he summarised basically what was the Greek thinking on the world, what the world would look like. And he wrote a book called Geography, which remained in manuscript and was more or less forgotten until the very early 14th century, when Byzantine scholars found it. And when printing began in 1450, they started publishing Ptolemy's map of the world. Now, Ptolemy never drew a map. There were directions in his manuscript as to what the map looked like, but no copy of the manuscript exists. So we don't know whether there was ever really a map or not. But this map that you can see here, in one of the publications, a 1482 publication of the Geographia, the Geography by Ptolemy, shows you what the summary was of Greek thought. And you see that huge land mass in the southern hemisphere. That is the land mass that the Greeks believed must be there, otherwise, to balance the land mass in the north. Otherwise the world would topple over. Now this view held sway, in diminishingly, but held sway until Cook's second voyage, when he conclusively proved there was no great legendary South Land. And the settlement of Australia is very much tied up, and the searching for Australia is very much tied up with finding this great South Land. Now, in 1483, Macrobius published his map of what the world looked like. Now, this was probably more influential than Ptolemy, really. It was a very clear map. Macrobius was in the 400s, but of course it didn't get published until the invention of printing. But once this map was published, it became, if you like, the guiding star to explorers, to find out what this land was like. Because Macrobius, as you can see, in the southern hemisphere, he's got the word perusta. That means burnt up. Then he's got the word, basically, it means the temporary zone, not yet known, the temperate zone, not yet known to us. And he uses the word antipodum, which is, of course, where we get antipodes from, because men would stand with their feet. You can imagine people in the northern hemisphere and people in the southern hemisphere's feet would touch the people in the northern hemisphere. So we were the antipodes, the opposite feet. And he said, and then of course Frigida down the bottom, which it speaks for itself and more or less is correct. There is Frigida down the bottom. And he said that if you could get through the Perustia, then there would be a temperate zone where people could live to match the temperate zone in the north. And what's more, it would mirror what was in the north. So there would be gold and minerals and spices and all this. So the race to find this land was about exploiting it for its mineral wealth, its trade possibilities, and learning about the people who lived there. Now, nothing much happened till the late 15th century, and then three great events happened, and that is the Portuguese, Diaz, rounded Cape of Good Hope in 1488. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama found the route to India around the Cape of Good Hope, which proved that Africa was not linked to any Great Southland. So that was an important breakthrough. And then in 1513, Balboa walked across the Isthmus of Panama, looked at the Pacific, and claimed it as a Spanish possession. Spain was very dominant at this time, and the Portuguese, once they had found this route, established a spice trade in the East Indies, and it would be the Dutch who would kick the Portuguese out in the early 17th century. So Ferdinand Magellan, who we all know, was actually Portuguese, but he had a bit of a bust-up with the King of Portugal, and so he went to work for Spain. And his great circumnavigation of the world in 1920, he of course entered the Pacific. And he found and named Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America. And he thought it was part of the southern continent. Magellan died before the circumnavigation got back, but in fact he named it the Pacific Ocean. And it was now clear that there was a route around Africa, and he found no evidence of a Great Southland in the Pacific. So where was this Great Southland? And following his voyage, Oronce Fine did a map in Paris, and you can see there's the Great Southland. It's not joined to Africa, which is here, not joined to Africa. And it looks as if it's not joined to the tip of South America. But Tierra del Fuego is here because that's what Magellan thought. It was part of the Great Southland, and this is South America, and here is the Great Southland, Terra Australis. And it's the first time the word Terra Australis is used, the Southland. And the caption goes on to continue, Terra Australis, recently discovered but not yet fully known. And I don't quite know where the recently discovered refers to Magellan thinking Tierra del Fuego was part of the Great Southland. So the maps continue to show this blob, and the next map is late in the 1570s, and it was by Abraham Ortelius. This is the first atlas, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, and this is considered of 1570 to be the first modern atlas. And it was printed and reprinted, many editions, and so this was what people thought of the Great Southland. As you can see there, it is an enormous blob at the bottom. And it has a long coastline, as you can see at the top. And what is written there is the land of parrots, so called by the Portuguese, who sailed along its coast for 2,000 miles but did not find the end. Of course, there's no evidence of that. An account of the called the land of parrots on account of the incredible number of birds seen here. They did tend to just make up things about what was it. Now, here you've got a whole lot of names like Beach, Lukac, and Malater. These are garbled names that come from Marco Polo's trip in the 13th century. And Marco Polo's travels were not really published until, of course, the invention of printing. And they were translated and mangled, but these words are used over and over again as if this is what Marco Polo saw, the Great South Land. Well, he didn't, of course, but they thought he did. And it must be very wealthy, because Marco Polo had been to wealthy lands. There was Solomon's Orpheum from the Bible, and maybe the Great South Land was part of Solomon's Orpheum. And once the Spanish had colonized South America, there were Inca legends about sailing out into the Pacific and coming to great islands of gold. So this all led Europeans to believe that if you followed and found this Great South Land, the first country to find it would be enormously wealthy. And you can see this is a later map of 1589, also by Ortelius. And there you can see that green blob is New Guinea and a bit of the Great South Land. They didn't know New Guinea by this time, or at least the north coast. Not sure whether the Great South Land is or is not linked to New Guinea. Of course, New Guinea was known to have gold, so maybe the Great South Land would. And the ship there is actually one of Magellan's ships, the Victoria. Now, Magellan had opened the way into the Pacific, and the Spanish followed pretty quickly in the late 16th century. And you have three great voyages. The first one was by Alvaro de Mendana. And Mendana basically, oh, that's Mendana. Actually, it could be. There's no, like Ptolemy, these drawings were made way after their dates. This was 19th century, what they thought, what they hoped Mendana would look like. So, the next one, please. Now, Mendana weaved his way through the Pacific and finally found what we call, or what was called, the Solomon Islands, or it is called Solomon Islands. And you can see there, he made two discoveries and stops. One was at this island up here, Santa Isabella, because the expedition had left on Santa Isabella's feast day, and San Cristobal. And he made two settlements there. It was a disaster. There was a lot of fighting between the natives and the Spanish, a lot of carnage. But Mendana thought he had in fact found an outlier to the Great South Land. He managed to sail around it and discovered that it was an island or two islands, and but it must have been the outlier to the Great South Land. Now, he calls it the Solomon Islands because of King Solomon's Orpheum, and that's why he thought this is going to be the Great South Land. There must be more. And he reported to the king that he made it up, really. He said there were large populations and thousands of souls in need of salvation. This was very important to the Spanish. They were looking for gold, yes, they were looking for treasure, yes, but they wanted to save souls. And desirable products, he wrote, cloves, ginger and nutmeg. They also say that there are pearls, and also there is gold. Of course, like everyone writing to their boss who wants something, they're trying to make it, he's trying to make it as enticing as he can, so he'll get another expedition to go and see what's south of the Solomon Islands. Well, he badgered his boss for 27 years. And finally he does get another expedition. And this time, Mendana goes off in 1595 and sails to, first of all, he comes to the Marquises. You can see the Marquises there. And then to Tuvalu. And so gradually bits of the Pacific are being discovered, but so far no great land. He's very taken with the Marquises, but once again there is dreadful killings between the natives and the Spanish. He moves on then to Santa Cruz. Now Santa Cruz is in the Solomons, but it is so far away from where they were. Here is Santa Cruz, and he was over here, Isabel, that he didn't realise it was the same land. They established a settlement, and Mendana was killed almost immediately. It was unhealthy, malaria, although Mendana did make the discovery that those who stayed on board ship did not succumb to malaria like those on land. He didn't know it was malaria, and he didn't make the connection, but he did make that observation. So he's dead, and his second in command was Pedro Fernandez de Queeros, who we'll all remember, de Queeros. And here is de Queeros, another one of these dodgy mid-19th century portraits. Queeros had to take the expedition now back to the Philippines.
That's the same photo.
Yeah.
Is that, have you,
That's the one you got in there for.
it's the same one?
Yeah, it's that.
No,
They're wearing the same hats.
no, it's a different one. That's what is it? No, that's Mendana, and then go on past that map. You go on to Queeros, unless I've made a terrible
There's another
mistake.
two maps.
And oh no, not there. Go back. No, go back. Go back. There. Oh well, you get the idea. They're all the same. They're all the same. They don't know. Queeros goes off, and he wanders around. The only good thing Queeros did on this voyage was that he requested that Luis de Torres be his second in command. That Torres is very popular, the men all love him, and he's to be the second in command. We know so little about Torres. We don't know when he was born, we don't know when he was died, we don't know anything about him except this voyage. And we don't have a picture, not even a dodgy one. So if we move on to the map, now that is of course Vanuatu, New Hebrides. This is where Queeros ends up. And after a lot of wandering around the Pacific, a lot of attempted mutinies, he wanders around and he comes to what we call now Vanuatu, and he establishes himself on the island of Espiritu Santo, because he named this island, which he thought was the Great South Land, Australia del Espiritu Santo, the great south land of the Holy Spirit. Why did he say Australia rather than Australia? He said it because the King of Spain was also a prince of the House of Austria, and he was sort of making a bit of a flattering remark about the king. Australia del Spiritu Santo. Now, he thought he'd found the Great Southland. He had very elaborate plans, Queeros. It was going to be called the New Jerusalem. It was going to be a marble city. He created a chivalric order, the Order of the Holy Ghost, and he invested every member of the expedition in that order. And he said he'd be going back home to send out 3,000 friars to convert the natives. And he took possession of this land in the name of King Philip III, Jesus Christ, the Pope, and several saints, which is rather over-egging the pudding. And all the islands and lands I have newly discovered and desire to discover as far as the South Pole. So he was really making an ambit claim there. Unfortunately, he was sailing, and Torres was sailing around, and Queeros disappears and actually went back to South America. But Torres waited for him, and there was no indication of where he'd gone. Torres discovered that Espiritu Santo was an island and not part of the Great Southland. And then Torres decided to explore himself. And we know what he did, don't we, Torres Strait. And so he sails down looking for land. He actually gets as far down on the Queensland coast as Mackay. And if he'd been able to get through the reef, he would have been the first person to land, first white person, of course, to land on the any part of Australia. But he didn't. He heads north again. He sails up here to a bit above that map, the Louisiade Archipelago in New Guinea, and he can't get through. So he now makes this rather courageous decision to sail through what's become known as Torres Strait. Now, you must remember he has no idea where he is and where he's going. Torres Strait takes him 40 days to get through. It is most treacherous. It is filled with islands and shoals. At some place, the actual water is only 2 meters deep. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to navigate. And if you're going today, you really need a special pilot who knows those waters well. And he sailed through. Now, did he see Australia? Well, if he'd come down the Endeavour way that Cook did, he would have sailed down here. But he certainly mentions Moa, which was called Banks Island. So he may have just gone this way. We have no idea really his exact route and whether he did see Australia or Cape York. In fact, the only thing we have about this voyage, except one letter which he wrote to the King of Spain, is this very important document in the Mitchell Library, the account by Prado, Diego de Prado y Toba, who was with Torres, and in about 1616 wrote this account. It didn't come to light until the late 1920s, and it caused a sensation. In fact, one of the books published about it was New Light on the Discovery of Australia. And this is Tobar's account of that whole expedition. And that's all we know. as I said, we know nothing more. I mean, Prado went off to be a monk, and we know nothing about Torres except this tremendous discovery of the strait between New Guinea and Australia. And of course, Torres did map some of the southern shore of New Guinea. No one would sail through this strait until Cook in 1770. Now, Queeros hadn't actually gone away when he went back. He went back. He did go back to Spain, and then he started badgering like Mendana had. He started badgering for another voyage, and another voyage, and they never give him one. And this is one of the Queeros Memorials. Now, these were printed in a very limited numbers. And they were published between 1607 and 1614, and there were 14 of them. And these were thought to be things like briefing papers for one of the advisory committees to the king. But there are only 14 of them in the world, and I'm very pleased to say Mitchell Library is the only institution in the world that has the entire 14. We only had 13 until a year ago, but now we have the last one, which we bought from a private collector in Australia. There are other copies of some of them, but by no means a full run of them. So these all go on. I mean, you read one, you read them all. They all go on about converting the populace and how it would be wonderful to bring Christianity to this place, and the king would be famous, and it's filled with gold, it's filled with treasure, blah, blah, blah. All of that, you know that. So that, it's all, read one, read them all. And, but he did get an expedition many years later, but he died. He was sent out to South America from Spain to begin this expedition. It is thought that the Viceroy had instructions when he got to Spain not to let him do anything, but this was just to get rid of him from Spain. Unfortunately, he died just when he arrived in South America, so he never got his second expedition. So that ends the Spanish, really, that had done quite a lot in finding about the Pacific. They were a declining power now, and the Dutch now come on the scenes. Now, almost at the same time that Torres, just a little bit before Torres was sailing through Torres Strait in 1606, just a few months earlier, the first Dutch vessel actually put foot on Australia. Now, the Dutch were quite open about the fact that they were not interested in converting people at all. They were interested in making money, that is all. And in fact, one of their poets, Just van den Vondel, wrote, and they had this up on a building in Amsterdam: wherever profit leads us to every sea and shore, for love of gain the wide world's harbours we explore. So it's quite clear, only about money. So William Jans, oh, this I should say is a Dutch map. Doesn't look like it, but the first map of Australia, really by itself. It's another blob. And you see New Guinea. They don't know whether New Guinea at this stage, of course this is late 1500s, they weren't aware of Torres' voyage. They don't know whether New Guinea is linked. But this is the Great Southland, and you can see there's a griffin, an archer, a snake, and a lion. Fabulous creatures that may exist in Australia. And in fact, during this period and later, there will be many books published about the strange creatures that exist in Australia, and the strange people, some suggesting they walked on their hands. The Antipodes, they walked on their hands. There was a lot of fantastic literature written about people who'd never been in the area, about what this was like. There was one particular one I'm fond of, which was written by a Frenchman, and it was about a person shipwrecked in the Pacific who was captured by a huge winged creature which lifted him up and deposited him on the shores of Western Australia into a society